Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 25th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about a brand new NBC News poll, a very interesting one that shows fascinating results, as you can tell from the title of this video. Now, the headline that NBC News released in relation to this poll does not do it justice at all. It says that Trump's GOP lead grows after latest indictment, poll finds, which is entirely true. Their new NBC News poll does show that Donald Trump is outrunning where he was before, doing better ever since the indictment, the second indictment that has come upon him by the United States government. Now, this lead has increased 51 to 22, nearly a 30-point advantage over Governor Ron DeSantis. The problem lies in the fact that this headline does not capture nearly as much as what you can take away from this poll as it should. So we are going to be unpacking it. We have the PDF version start to finish, and there are so many fascinating parts about it that I want to explore it with you all today. So to cover just the very interesting baseline numbers on the NBC News poll, we're going to start with the approval ratings for certain candidates. Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, the rest of the Republican crew, and we will eventually get back into discussing the GOP primary lead, but there are way more interesting results than just that alone. To begin, it asked traditional electorate questions. These really don't provide us much context about the state of the poll. Generally speaking, these numbers end up being around the same. Why? Because they tried to get a representative sample of the United States. On the baseline, roughly 20% of voters believe that the country is headed in the right direction, whereas 74%, the highest since August of 2022, believe that the country is going in the wrong direction. 74% say we are on the wrong track. And that's important to note, because it means there is a general discontent, whether Democrat, Republican, or Independent, about where we are as a nation and where we are headed. There are different reasons why people might answer right direction or wrong direction, which is exactly why we can't read too much into these numbers. Generally speaking, the American public is never happy with the direction of the nation, so that's also something to keep in mind. But at this point in time, it's at a pretty bad point. On the baseline, you would expect this to be bad news for President Biden. And in a way, while it might be, he isn't nearly as in bad of a position as this initial number might suggest. And there's reasons for that, as we will see. So again, we said we would talk about the approval ratings, namely President Joe Biden's job approval rating by the rest of the nation. Currently speaking, 43% of respondents have a approve in terms of the way that he's handling his job, whereas 53% have a total disapprove, an overall net negative of 10 points nationwide. For context, leading into the midterm elections in 2022, he was down about 9 points. So a little bit of a difference there, but nothing super significant. But keep in mind that Biden is down 10 points nationwide. And since Donald Trump is not in office, we have to take a look at his favorability rating numbers. We used his approval rating when he was in office, and now we look at the favorability rating because it tells you how much voters like or dislike him as a candidate. Ultimately, these numbers are significantly worse than even the favorability numbers are for Joe Biden. Right now, you see a combined overall force here of 56% of respondents saying that they have a somewhat negative or very negative view of the former president, whereas on the very positive or somewhat positive side, you just have 34%. That is an overall net negative of 22 points nationwide for favorability. Joe Biden is down just 9 points. It's in this situation that reminds me a lot of the 2016 election, except on the flip side now, where Hillary Clinton was more unpopular than Donald Trump, but narrowly. And when people were choosing between the lesser of two evils, they ultimately chose Donald Trump in many of the important swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, etc., because they slightly disliked him less. And the overall totality here, what you see here is that Donald Trump is disapproved of by 22 points on the overall net negative. Joe Biden is down 9 points. Ron DeSantis is down roughly 16 points. So that's a very big difference than where it was before. Ron DeSantis, in prior to the summer polls, you can see when he was not running against Donald Trump that he was actually approved of nationwide, but a lot of damage has been done by the Trump campaign against Ron DeSantis' character to a point where a significant portion of the country now disapproves of him as a candidate. But these are numbers that I think matter only to the extent that they translate to some level of election results. They aren't everything. I think that policy does matter still, and I think that the stances on issues are going to make or break this election. And also what's going to make or break the election is the view of extremism for the country. Now, unfortunately, we don't have numbers in these polls, but we can see it in the general election data, where Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are both being pitted up against Joe Biden. I said we would briefly, though, talk about the primary results here. I've already told you that it's 51 to 22 on the first choice ballot. The interesting number here, too, that I think nobody really talks about is the second choice option that many of these voters have. When they're asked this question, okay, if you were given the first choice amongst the list here, Donald Trump down to Burgum, who would you choose as your first choice? Who would you choose as your second choice? And then they combine the numbers. And you can see here that Donald Trump receives 51% of first choice voters. That's a majority, and that's enough to win the nomination outright. If he's at 51% in February 2024, the nomination is secure, and nobody should even expect him to lose, potentially even a singular primary, with the exception of maybe Utah. So 51% at the baseline, Ron DeSantis is at 22%, but this second choice part is what really gets me. 31% of respondents, more than even in the first choice for Ron DeSantis, say that Ron DeSantis is their second choice. I think a lot of this comes from the Donald Trump camp, but I think a lot of it also comes from the remaining contenders list here. Those who are voting for Mike Pence probably don't want Donald Trump to be the nominee, especially given how far out Mike Pence has been pushed away from the former president. 7%, I can imagine that nearly all of that translates to a Ron DeSantis second choice. Same thing with even other candidates like Chris Christie. Chris Christie, who is currently polling at 5% as a first choice. A lot of his voters are probably never Trumpers, as he is as well, meaning they probably shift over to someone like Ron DeSantis. But the problem is that the first choice is what really matters. Donald Trump has improved off his April 2023 numbers when Ron DeSantis wasn't even in the race, going from 46% to 51%, and Ron DeSantis suffering significant attacks from Donald Trump's campaign, now reduction in support from when he wasn't even in the race. Keep in mind how crazy it is to think about this. Ron DeSantis was never even in the race, 31% down to 22%. So you're at a point where Trump is up, DeSantis is down, but the reason why I think this heavy focus is on this first choice is because that's what matters, right? Donald Trump isn't dropping out of this race. He has no reason to. He is the likeliest nominee at this point in time. He is, in fact, the presumptive GOP nominee by many metrics. And, whether that's endorsements, whether that's polling, whether that's fundraising, nearly every metric, if not all metrics, indicate that Donald Trump will be the 2024 nominee. And in this head-to-head, the reason why I think also Donald Trump is presumed to be this presumptive nominee is because when given the opportunity to vote just in a two-way race, and this is the way that we've been talking about, if Donald Trump was to lose the nomination, it would have to be in a two-way race between him and DeSantis. Well, guess what? DeSantis still loses, not just by a few points. Old numbers used to show him tying, beating Trump, narrowly losing to Trump, throwing all of that out of the window now. He's down 24 points amongst Republican voters nationwide. So what you should take away from this primary numbers is that, hey, DeSantis is in second place, but a distant second place and well outside the margin to catch up. Now, here's where the numbers really matter. Here's where I am seeing some major breakthroughs on the side of, okay, is DeSantis more electable? Is Trump going to win this nomination just to lose the general election? And how do you compare it to standard and stereotypical Republicans and Democrats? Fortunately for us, they did a generic ballot poll, which we will talk about in just a moment. The reason why generic ballot matters is because it translates to elections beyond the presidential. It tells you where at a baseline where voters are leaning, either towards Democrats or Republicans, taking out the presidential contenders. And in 2022, Republicans won the national popular vote when it came down to this election. They won by just a few points, and that generic ballot landed them a victory in the House of Representatives. So if Democrats are leading it now again, chances are they could win back control of the House. I'm making a video about that later today, talking about a recent Supreme Court decision that might actually hand the Democrats a significant opportunity at winning control of the House. But that's beyond the point. What matters here It's where voters are at a baseline. Not only does it translate to down-ballot election results, but it tells you if they were given the option with a no-name Republican and a no-name Democrat, who would they prefer for 2024? And that's also a point of reference that could be very, very important as we look to the ever-evolving 2024 electoral map. So back to the numbers here. This is the same electoral group, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, pitted up against each other. Joe Biden wins by 4. In the last election, he won by 5. So I will say, this is a reduction in national support, but it does show that there is a significant portion of the population that's saying, hey, I want Joe Biden to win again, even though they disapprove of him by 10 points. Just 43% of respondents approve of the job that he's doing, yet 6% more would choose him over Donald Trump. Donald Trump being at just a 34%, 35%, 36% favorability rating, 45% of voters say pitted against Joe Biden, they would choose him. This is a 4-point loss for Donald Trump, which is an improvement from 2020, but by all means is still a loss. I mean, if this poll was to hold true, Joe Biden still wins the election, narrowly as it was back in 2020, but it's still an election victory. This is roughly where it was back in the last election. But the more interesting number is the one that comes down to Ron DeSantis and Joe Biden. Amongst the same electorate that prefers Joe Biden over Donald Trump by 4%, prefers Ron DeSantis and Joe Biden to the same level. Joe Biden at 49, Donald Trump at 45, but against DeSantis and Biden, they're both at 47, which means there has and was a respondent in this poll that there was a Biden over Trump voter that chose DeSantis over Trump. These are the independent voters that the DeSantis campaign is trying to make the argument to the GOP that he wins over small amounts of the independent electorate that are enough to make a difference. If the 2020 presidential election was, let's say, tied on the national popular vote, meaning that Joe Biden's 4.5% victory nationwide would translate to roughly a 4.5% shift back to the GOP, a lot of these swing states would be red. Let's think about them for a moment, right? Not any of the Clinton states besides Nevada, but very important ones. A state, Wisconsin, right? Donald Trump outperformed the national vote by over 3 points. It was 0.6% compared to 4.5. That would have gone to the GOP had the national popular vote been tied, and you took those results and adjusted the remaining margins. And you can do so in fair confidence. That's how a lot of these elections work, right? Michigan would be red. Pennsylvania would be red. Georgia would be red. Arizona would be red. Nevada would be red. You're starting to see the understanding as to why this tied electorate is damaging to the Democratic Party and why, yes, DeSantis' argument that he is more electable is true. But he has to get to the general election first. But another fascinating number that we can take away from this result is that 47 to 47, while not a victory for Ron DeSantis, is still monumental, there's even more of a bit of a monumental part of what this poll suggests. Because beyond the general election, we asked this question. We saw this question asked, not we. I mean, I'm not part of NBC News. The question that was asked here was, in the congressional elections in November 2024, would you prefer a Congress controlled by Republicans or a Congress controlled by Democrats? And the responses were 48% say Democrats, 46% say Republicans. Now, earlier this year, in January, the Republicans led the Democrats by 1 point nationwide. This is a 3-point swing towards the Democratic Party. Now, think about that. 46% of respondents say that they want a Republican-controlled Congress. How many people said they wanted Ron DeSantis to defeat defeat Joe Biden? 47%. A 1% increase that may not seem super significant. 1% out of 100, you're talking about a fraction here. But it's a meaningful one. Because it tells us there are voters that said that they prefer a Democratic-controlled Congress but a Ron DeSantis presidency. There are voters there that had no answer in a Biden to DeSantis matchup that said they would prefer a Democratic-controlled Congress. Ron DeSantis, unlike Donald Trump, is outperforming the generic Republican. And that is so important because the generic Republican in 2022 did a lot better than the Trump-endorsed Republicans in many of these House races and especially in these Senate races. When Mark Kelly was up for election in 2022, there were polls early 2021 and late 2021 before it became clear that there was a frontrunner on the GOP side for the nomination about a generic Republican pitted against Mark Kelly. And nearly every single one of those polls, he was losing. It's the same case with Catherine Cortez Masto. She was losing to this no-name generic Republican. So was John Fetterman. So were so many of these other candidates, Raphael Warnock also being one of them. Maggie Hassan at different points was down to a generic Republican. Why am I telling you this? Because all of these Republicans, literally every single one, underperformed what a generic Republican would have done in these races. And while a generic Republican isn't the perfect representation, it is a non-Donald Trump Republican, as has been perfectly described in previous polls. That in the same ones where we have seen polls done, conducted with a potential nominee, the Trump-endorsed one, versus a generic Republican, the generic Republican always does better. And the fact that Ron DeSantis, as a candidate that has made his name known, is outperforming this Republican where people are just building up this conception in their brains. Okay, a generic Republican is someone who believes in X, Y, and Z. And in most cases, because they're given the agency to think about it on their own end, it's probably going to be more positive than negative, right? When you're given the agency to say, okay, this is a generic Republican, you're going to say this is somebody that captures the party in the way that I believe the party should be captured, which means they are going to think about it from a slightly more positive way. Which is why these numbers end up being so predictable and indicative, but in some of these other races that are more competitive, where candidate quality does matter, Senate, governor, House level, you still see some shockers, right? A district that might prefer a Republican narrowly voted for John Fetterman or voted for the Democrat or voted for whatever it might be that didn't align with the generic standard. But the fact is that Ron DeSantis performs better than the generic poll, which really is quite shocking because it shows that not only is he doing better than Donald Trump, but he is doing better than Republicans are nationwide. He is doing better, which means there are independent voters out there that align with Ron DeSantis where they may not align with Republicans at large. They choose and prefer DeSantis over Biden, even if they don't prefer the Republican Party. That is a takeaway that I think is so fascinating by this result that I really did not expect. So as we look ahead to 2024, we have to think about this from the perspective of the primary, which Donald Trump will probably win, and also the perspective of the general election. I released an election prediction yesterday where I had Donald Trump losing to Joe Biden 319 to 219, losing the state of North Carolina, and every other state stays the same way. But Ron DeSantis doing that much better than Donald Trump, 4 points makes so much of a difference. If it was a 4-point difference in 2012 off of what it was in favor of the GOP, Mitt Romney would have been running for a second term against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Think about that for a moment. How much our politics, our lives would have changed if the circumstances were different by just 4 points. And it isn't just 4 points. It's also just a few points as well. 2 points can make a difference. 1 point can absolutely make a difference, as 2020 can also show you. 1 point more Republican, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona would have gone red, and Donald Trump would have been reelected. So from this NBC News poll, which captured by the headline does not do it justice, there are just 4 main takeaways I want us to take away from this poll. It's a long one. You can explore it yourself. It's on their website, but I will say this is what I got away from it. Number 1, Donald Trump outruns polls from 2020, but doesn't reach 50%. It's a problem that in a normal reality, Donald Trump should be leading Joe Biden, but it's also a problem for Joe Biden to not match expectations from 2020, especially when people like myself expect him to outrun his 2020 margin. Now, I think that's with time and, moving forward towards the election and following this indictment, but I do think that there is some level of concern there. Now, the second point is that Ron DeSantis does outperform Donald Trump by 4 points. You apply this to 2020, and the GOP would have done better than they did even in the 2016 presidential election. Another point, too, that I just made and hammered in is that Ron DeSantis outperforms a generic Republican. That means there are Democratic House and Senate voters that picked Ron DeSantis and shows that he has a level of electability above the normal and traditional Republican, though that doesn't translate to a primary victory. And the final thing here, though, is what I will say is that some good news for Democrats is that neither Trump or DeSantis lead Biden. That's a problem, given that Joe Biden is down 10 points and amongst the same electorate that disapproves of him as a person, as a leader in this country, they still can't get a lead amongst these voters. There is a level of disconnect between GOP general election voters, or what the GOP does for the general election, and what they could do. There are people here who are saying to the poll respondents, I disapprove of Joe Biden's presidency, yet I'm voting for him for another 4 years. It was a problem that Republicans faced in 2022 that if they capitalized on it effectively, they could have easily won back control of the House by excessive margins, easily won back control of the Senate, which they did not do. I'm reminded of the 2010 House election results because I will tell you, this was an election that Republicans reasonably could have expected in 2022. And yet they got a far, far, far away from satisfactory result. Because in 2010, President Obama was disapproved of nationwide by, get this, just 5 points. On Election Day in 2022, Biden was down by 10. And yet the results were so dramatically different. It'll be interesting to see how this changes over time, but the takeaway from these NBC News polls, I think, are very, very fascinating and ones that deserve a lot more conversation and discussion than what even this video has done, and I encourage you to look into it, continue reading, continue researching, because there are a lot of numbers that don't make major headlines that tell you a big, fuller story about the state of the race for the 2024 presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.